This review is brought to you in part by Ryder's Hobby Shops, where the fun begins. Stop in to one of Ryder's two convenient Michigan locations where you'll find a full range of the latest hobby products, supplies, parts, tools, and paint. You'll find aisles and aisles of scale model kits, RC models, model rockets, Warhammer gaming, and railroading products. Stop in at Ryder's today and tell them Doug sent you. This review covers the Autocar A64B semi-tractor. It's a 125 scale kit from AMT number 1099. Now, the Autocar company is an American specialist manufacturer of Class 7 and 8 severe duty trucks. They've been in business off and on for 125 years. Autocar started at Pittsburgh in 1897 as a manufacturer in the brass era of automobiles, and trucks from 1899, where they continued to concentrate their efforts. It might surprise you to know that the Autocar is the oldest surviving motor vehicle brand in the United States. Now, when it comes to models, subject matter's king, and there's not a lot of choices out there for Autocar semi-tractors, and that's why AMT is able to reissue this kit over and over. Now, while the mold is still in pretty good shape and the new tires and decals are really great, the kit suffers greatly from heavy sprue connections and poorly illustrated instructions. Now, we can help by showing you how the model is built, but the heavy sprue connections on the chrome parts would require repair and refinishing for a contest model. Now, this model has about 250 pieces, but many aren't used. The kit is molded in white and plated parts along with red, amber, and clear transparent pieces. It comes with two metal axles, soft vinyl pad printed tires, and some flexible tubing. Now, when you're done, the model is about 11 3/4 inches long, 4 inches wide, and 4 1/4 inches high. Here are the contents of the kit. As you can see, there's quite a few there, but it's a single-purpose kit, so all but a lot of the small lights and some of the optional features would be used. And it does have an optional refrigeration unit, AC, for the top of the cab. But other than that, you'll use most of the rest of the pieces, just light flash, a few sink marks, and ejector pins in almost everywhere. We'll be using mostly tube glue for slow setting areas, and probably half and half with super glue type adhesives, white glue or crystal clear for the glass part. Read the manufacturer safety and use guidelines when using any of the products that you see or hear used in the review. Here are the decals for the kit. The register is great, and the decals have a nice weight to the carrier film. They go on pretty well, but you will need some setting solution to have them conform to the rivets and panel lines. Right from the start, here are some pieces that will not be used. They belong to other kits, and I didn't use the refrigeration unit for the cab and various other pieces, which you'll see later on at the end of the review. Now, construction starts with the engine, and here are all the components. There's quite a few pieces to this motor, and you see all the markings I made there prior. I was going to paint this in the usual scheme, but subsequent investigation on the internet showed that this engine was just all painted kind of a light brown tan color. I'll show you some of the construction steps so you can see placement. Here you'll notice the manifolds in position along with the oil cooler there and the starter in the lower left. And here the other side, you see the water manifold up at the top. It just kind of fits right over the exhaust. I used a toothpick to line up the front end pulleys as such so that they would just stay into place until the glue set. And now here you see at the lower, the corner there in the lower left, there's the oil, external oil line that goes down to the pan. And then up in the underneath the manifold there, for the intake manifold, you see the fuel pump line that's attached to the side of the fuel pump there. This is kind of tricky, but it don't really show where it goes, but it just kind of heads over in that direction. And you can see this from the completed engine. It was painted that light tan color, and the black flat black belts, of course. Also, the transmission in the back's been added, and that's a 2-piece 3/2 that go together. And here's the right side. You see the same color scheme, and this is what your engine will look like upon completion. I'm going to break off from the sequence of the build here to work on the cab and some of the body parts. You can see there's a little bit of parting line flash there that needs to be addressed. There's a little segment of the forward part of the cab there towards the bottom that needs to be removed. It's got a score on the inside, so you need to finish clipping that off and sanding it smooth. After you're satisfied with cleanup on the body, paint that with some primer. First I used a light gray coat and then a white coat to keep that blue very bright. Okay, now we're going to skip the wheels section and go right to the basic chassis. That's section 3. And you're going to get some quasi directions here to place things in channels and ridges, etc., etc. And here's where your basic pieces go. The one really strange one is the rear cross member there, which just fits kind of flush at the back end. So go ahead and glue those together with slow glue, and then you can use some rubber bands to keep that in place so it dries nice and true. There are left and right front springs, and there is a hole, a boss, and a receiver for the front part there. But then the back just kind of nudges up and nestles onto the bottom of the frame. These V-shaped fender braces go next. The ones with the upward angles are in the back, and if you probably don't know it yet, but the placement of these things are critical. They have to be placed exactly properly vertically, and also they have to be perpendicular to the frame, because those are the things that your fender is going to mount to. Those little tabs on the top there, yeah, that's where your fenders mount. So there's no real way to put this together ahead of time. So you simply hope you get it right. Make sure it's perpendicular to the frame and in the correct hole. You see that goes, the one in the front is ahead of the spring, and then the one in the back, goes into that boss and receiver. The two front cab supports fit into a little notch. It's actually fairly accurate. Those brackets just go over those notches. You see a little X on top there. So glue those into place and against the frame. It's not real clear in the illustration, but that crossover member there, the mid crossover, fits over the frame and clasps on the outside of the frame in between those two black marks you see on this illustration. The rear tow hooks have no actual prime location marked or anything to tell you where to put them. Put them in the center of the frame vertically, and then towards the back, move the back portion all the way to the back so that you don't cover up those slots just in front of them. The instructions just kind of point to the inside of this frame rail here, and the brackets actually fit nicely in there, but just center it up in between the cross members. There's no real location made for it. These parts, the anti-skid control plates, are very ambiguously shown here. It's actually tipped sideways and backwards, and so the plate that you see there, those are the ones with the X's on them, are actually jammed into the cross member underneath and behind, so that the plates stick up at an angle like that. But make sure they're not too high, or it will interfere with later in construction. The illustration here shows the side plate that goes on top of the frame. Notice they don't have those skid plates sticking up there in the air, because you can't. They're covered, and if they're too high, this plate will not lay flat. So here are the parts for step 5, the springs and the rear axle, and there's 4 air chambers missing here for the front section rotors, brake, those brakes in the back, but they go on to the backing plates too. But there's a little trick to putting this whole assembly together, and I'll show you that right away. First thing I did was glue the axle halves together and the center axle gearbox there, and then kind of clean up the seams so that the parting line isn't so visible. You see the underside here of the chassis and the plates that are used to mount the taillights and the license plate. Now the larger one goes on the driver's side of the frame, and they just fit right there on the corners. I left the taillights off, unlike the instructions say, until after all the frame was assembled and painted. The instructions will show you magically balancing the crossover members here, the axles, and the lower spring sections into them and gluing them into place, apparently touching the top of the springs to the axle itself. But I didn't like that idea, so I drilled through them and then pinned them so that they were actually aligned. So after I had gotten the axles pinned into position, they actually could still swing and be adjustable. I put the axle drive shaft into place and then glued it into position on one of the axle housings there so that I knew where it was going to land. I also used the cross member tube there you see with X on it, but it didn't really fit. We'll talk about that in a minute. I took the components off of the spring assemblies there because I knew that they would mount perfectly where they needed to be and would be the correct width, which the cross tube was throwing off. I then repinned the rear axle into position and then added the forward housing with the intermediate axle between the two of them in place. Now here's the cross tube, and as you can see, the markings there are kind of a stop, but when you push both sides into the markings, it becomes too narrow for the frame. So I had to replace it. I drilled it out where it goes, and then I used a piece of 80 thousandths tube to replace it. The arrow points to the replaced cross tube there, and the arrows are pointing to backing plates that go on the ends of the axles. Now, I had trimmed off all of the pins that I put in and glued everything into position so that it wouldn't move. You can also see the two metal axles, that are shafts that are in there for the rear wheels. In step 6, you see the pieces here for the front axle. So assemble those as a group and get them ready for construction. Now we can add the springs to the frame as the chassis is upside down here. And if it mounts properly in front with a post and then snugs up in the back against the frame. And you can see the axle here. It's laying upside down, and it'll get glued to those center positions of the springs. And you see it here. Use some strong glue right behind those black lines that I'd drawn on the springs. It goes into position. Make sure that everything's all squared up, equidistant from the frame. Now we're going to add the gearbox and the mount, and you can glue the gearbox to the mount first. And you see that oblique lines there. That's the ridge that mounts along the top rail of the frame. And you see it right side up here. You can see it just over the top of the frame there, and it's glued into position into a post and hole. Turning the frame back around upside down, you can see up at the top here the tie rod has been glued into position on the axle, and I drilled that locating mount points out a little bit so that it was easier and more stable to glue that into place. Now we can assemble the rest of the steering assembly. You see the pieces arrayed here, and it gets a little bit tricky. It's not very well illustrated. They show you where they go, but not the attitude and position, so we'll show you that. Okay, we'll use a series of close-ups here, and we're going to mark the various parts. The steering link, which is two pieces together, that's going to be shown with a red arrow. The transfer lever will be shown with a blue arrow, the pitman arm there with a white arrow, and the power steering cylinder will be shown with a black arrow. So you can see how they're all assembled. Okay, now that that's all glued together, I'm going to set that aside to dry thoroughly and work on step 7, the chassis accessories. I decided to paint some of the tank's body color, or just like the cab, I should say. And that meant that I might as well paint all of the body color accessory parts at the same time, which you see here. Since they're assembled in halves, you have to do a little cleanup. I glued them together and kind of scuffed off the seams there with the glue, and then I put a little of my favorite auto body glazing compound putty on to smooth out those joints. Here they are, shown in blue color of the cab. And while those accessory parts are drying, it was time to paint the entire chassis assembly. And that's, takes a few passes because there's a lot of nooks and crannies. And sometimes you can go in with a brush and then paint the spray just to make sure you get full coverage on everything. But you see here a series of the photos that show it off. It's a pretty impressive unit. I had put some putty on the end of the axle there in front from step 6, and now it was time to add the rest of the pieces there. I didn't want to put them in place before that so that they didn't get paint on them. So that just assembles pretty simply. You put the axle tab in the back, and then you trap it into place and glue it to the backing plates for the axle. Giving the chassis and the axle caps there a chance to dry, so I'm jumping into the interior for step 8. You can see the seats are assembled here to their bases, well, the one on the left, and then the 2-piece for the seats for the driver. Assemble the steering column mast jacket to the steering wheel itself, and make sure that it is vertical in all directions. The instrument panel comes with gauges molded in, but I wanted to add a little more to those, so I used some from Best Model Parts. They do a nice job with gauges, and then the rest I just scratched off the needles so that you could see where they were, and it came out pretty nice for a truck instrument panel. Step 8 and step 9 are pretty much linked together. You've got the interior of the cab and the cab itself. So you see the cab here painted in bright blue, and the windows that'll go into that as well. Here you see the parts all painted and staged for assembly. If you're wondering, the blue that I used, it came decanted from a can of Do It Best hardware spray called Sky Blue. It's a gloss enamel, and it's number 317519. Now, you notice I flipped the box art here. It has blue fenders and a black cab, and I reversed that. The fenders got painted black with some TS14 Tamiya paint, and also the steering and the seat frames here, they were painted with the same color. The seats themselves are kind of a leather color, a tan, a light brown, and the flat black is on the firewall and the bucket. Now you can install the seats into the interior bucket, and I noticed that the shifter was right in front of the passenger seat, so I filled it with a little putty, and I'll move that over later. Now the instrument panel gets glued into the dash, and you see there's a little accent there. The chrome pen was used to highlight the shifters on the steering. Now you'll see that I glued the pedals here, the control pedals, to the back of the dash there, so that they were not so far on the floorboards as in the model, and the steering column is glued into place as well. And then it fits right into the dashboard there, right up against the verticals and in front of the seats. You can glue the windows into position inside the cab, and I use Microscale's Crystal Clear. It seems to be a little more tackier and stickier than regular white glue, but it dries pretty clear. If you're building a contest model, then you'll notice that the back of the seats on this model are seen through the back window, so you may want to go ahead and fill those with some sheet stock first. It's hard to see with the naked eye, but these tires are marked beautifully as Uniroyal truck tire, and they're not perfect tires all around. They're real nice and flexible, but I think they're made for a range of AMT's kits, so they're not they're a little bit large for the wheels, the inner diameter there. So I had to use a little of the BSI tire glue to tack those into position and keep them there. Here are the parts for the front tires, and there's a nice chrome wheel up front. Also, you notice some scratched off chrome inside the one set there, and that's because glue doesn't stick to chrome. You have to scrape it off. Paint as well, so remember to do that. So here you see gathered up the pieces for the rear wheels. The outer rims were painted with the body color blue, and the wheels themselves are painted gloss black with the Tamiya TS14. And so here are the parts to assemble one of the dualies in the rear. And of course, you have to scratch that paint off the ridges where the edges meet. And so first, of course, you just put the outer and inner hubs together, and they kind of just nestle into a spot there in the middle of the back side of the wheel, and glue them into position with some strong glue. And then you add the outer wheel as it's shown here, and finally you put the tire into position on each side. And like I said, I used a little tire glue for that, and then add the outer rims and pop them into position, and the inner rim, and just kind of pop that into position so that it fits nice and snug against them. Scrape the paint off the centers of the rear wheels and add those hubcaps, and your wheels are all assembled now. Let them dry and stage them for further assembly. Just insert the metal axles again if you haven't, and then squeeze the rear dualies into position against each other until they stop, and then the rear wheels are in place. The front wheels are glued to the rotor hubs that you installed onto the ends of the backing plates earlier. Next, we're going to install the motor into the frame. There's some notches on each side of the frame rails inside, and the red arrow points to the right side there. So we're going to glue that into position there. It really only goes in one place. The front just kind of nestles into a groove slot behind the front end balancer. Then add the drive shaft just before everything gets settled into position, and I used a piece of tape there to kind of hold it up, make sure that it stayed, because it's not a perfect fit from end to end. Now that the tank parts are blue, the rear flaps and the engine parts are flat black, and then the fifth wheel pieces are gloss black. We also have some chrome pieces there for the fuel tanks with the steps and the caps. The top portion of the tank bracket fits onto the frame, but it's not easy to see. Scrape some paint off on outside ridges of those two ridges that are placed on the frame there, and glue it into position. Now note that the fuel tanks are left and right. The fuel filler cap goes to the forward section. And also, you can add your stair steps there. You just scrape a little bit of glue there where the mating surface for the top part of the stairs meets the tank, and also chrome from that side too. Here are the battery boxes all glued together, and if you're wondering if the batteries are installed in there, it's a closely guarded secret. But anyway, scratch off some of the paint from the back ridge and the place where they go onto the frame, and some squiggly ridges there. You can see that right behind that one cross member. The shorter of these two air tanks goes on the passenger side here. You can see one's starting right about the mid cross member section. So scratch the paint off and glue that in, and just know that the other side is almost identical, except that I actually moved it forward just a little bit to make sure it cleared those tires behind the battery box there. Now we'll add the exhaust pipe to the end of the exhaust manifold, and also there's a bracket there that helps hold it up that's applied to the frame first. In this mock-up, I used some putty to hold the pieces in place, and as you can see, the engine is where it has to be, and so the pipe is attached to the end of the exhaust, but it doesn't leave enough room for that bracket just in front of the battery box. So I cut a little piece off of the end of the exhaust pipe where it attaches to the exhaust manifold, to give it just enough room for the bracket to come straight out from the frame and glued everything together. Now we can go ahead and add the mounting bracket to the skid plate there, and also the fifth wheel will go into position. It just snaps on and actually continues to pivot just like a regular fifth wheel. Scratch off a little paint on the frame there and add the slide plate there, and make sure that those anti-skid plates don't interfere with it so that it lies flat on the frame. Now we're going to add the mud flaps, and those little hooks there, they just go into the slots. You'll still have to take some of the paint off there to glue them into position. Make sure that they're horizontal to each other, that they are equidistant from the tires as well. And here's the pogo stick there, and it got painted a brass color with some gloss black entrapments, but it's not going to be installed at this time. I wanted to get the cab in place first. It's time to install the fenders, and so get those staged in position. I test fitted the cab into position to make sure it didn't interfere with the fenders. And you see those two dots there? They're the top of the fender mount brackets, and that's what your fender fits into. There's two tiny little places in the fenders where they're glued to that. And so with that knowledge, I took a look at adding the cab into position, because where it goes, everything else kind of has to follow. Now, it rides on some really small mounting points. A couple of tiny little places on that rear mount. You see it just barely hanging on the edge there in the back. So knowing that, I decided to add a little piece of square stock in the back, same height as the rear bracket mounts, and give it something to actually glue it to. As my extra mounting bracket there was drying in place, I decided I would finish off the radiator because it's kind of got some black wash that needs to be applied. About 2 or 3 coats of that, and she looked just great. Now I have to work on the radiator and the surround. So we're going to put the inner section of the radiator into place behind the grill. And it actually fits right in there, nestles in between the side rails and up into the top. And up at the top, a tiny little ridge will provide room for the hood to rest on. Once again, with another mock-up, we're going to place the cab on the little tabs and bosses in front and in the back. And then we're going to fit the radiator into place on the little front portions of the frame there. You can see it goes right on there, and you glue that at the base. And then to lock that into position, we're going to tilt it with the hood in place to make sure that it fits. And just before we do that, we are going to add the fenders into place on those tiny little bosses for the fender mounts. Use some strong super glue, and then make sure that they are level. We'll show you that in a minute. And the grill will go on just after that. Use some super glue to glue your cab into position on its mounts, the front and the rear. And then make sure that the radiator doesn't move. We use some slow glue on that, by the way, slow setting glue. And then put it all together so that it fits perfectly. At this point, I was able to use the 2 tabs at the top of the hood to tack those hood sides into position, and then later on add a bead of strong glue along the ridge inside to get the hood's sides perfectly aligned with the frame and the hood. And one of the reasons that all of this has to be assembled in exact position is because your huge decal stripes, if you use them, won't line up if the panels aren't lined up and you try and piecemeal it together. So with everything in position, now it's time to add the decals into place. You can see here those nice blue stripes, the American flag, the state ID information on the side there. I started in the back, and then I worked toward the front on each side to make sure that it all stayed aligned. And now it's time to assemble some of the canisters and chrome parts together. You can see, that they come in various pieces. There's 2 pieces for the lower tanks there, and 3 for the top one, the air. And I didn't like the sink that was on the curved exhaust tip, so I elected to go with the straight one. So we're going to glue that together. Also, I used a little black wash on that exhaust, and it seemed to be installed backwards according to the exhaust pipe that comes out of the engine, but I cut that off flush and turned it around so that the radiator grill on it was facing out. Well, like I said, I didn't use the AC unit for the cab, so it's time to install those huge trumpets and the lighting for the top of the cab with some of the orange or amber lights. Unfortunately, as we mentioned, the sprues are full-size sprues on the sides of these lights. When you trim the sprue off, this is what you get. And the only way, of course, would be to refinish and repair, but they're pretty small for that. Anyway, there's also a tab in the bottom which kind of interferes with it sitting level on the top of the cab, so I sanded that off too. Here are the amber lights. They've got a little bit of flash. You have to trim those off the best you can. So here are the lights and the horns placed on top of the cab. There's options, different arrangements that you can do with those suggested in the instructions. You see here there are some pieces that go under the hood yet in the engine bay. But there's also a number of parts that will go on to the sides of the hood, so we'll install those now too. To get these hold downs, by the way, they don't show you where the rear hold downs go in the instructions at all. They just mention that there's 4 of them, but they'll go right there in the back, and where you see that arrow, that's one of the holes that I drilled, and just glue those into place with some super glue. Also, you can just get some of the chrome off of the mating surface where you're going to glue the handles on and the script there, and glue those into place with some super glue. Before we put the hood back into place, there's 3 pieces that go into the engine bay. You see them here. The portion of the intake pipe that fits on top of the engine and extends into the firewall was a little long. I had to cut off about 1/8 of an inch of the part that goes into the firewall to make it fit properly on top of the engine. You see the chrome air cleaner canister here that goes into a large hole in the side of the cowl, and it just glues into place. Make sure it's perpendicular. Now we can start working on some of the lighting fixtures. These are the side reflectors, and they're actually pointed sideways from the center longitude of the unit, so that you could see the semi from the side. Now I drilled a hole there and used the little stud piece that was at the bottom of them, the chrome part, to actually engage into the hole and glue it into position. Also, there are fender reflectors, and I did the same thing with those. I drilled a small hole in the top of the fender and glued those fender reflectors into position. And now here you can see the large bumper. It's a beautiful piece, except of course for the huge attachment points for the sprue. You know, there's 2 in the bottom, 1 on the top. Trimmed them off and did my best to cover them up with a little chrome paint, but you can still see that they are visible. Now, I also took some artistic liberties here. The orange tree had some square lights that looked ominously like the perfect fit for those holes in there. Now, those holes are actually for hooks, tow hooks that are behind the bumper, but I decided I was going to put them into place. I used a little sheet stock and glued it onto the backside to be some backing for my what I'm going to call them is driving lights. And also there are some driving lights that come with the vehicle. They're in nacelles there. You see the chrome pieces, and those go into the underside of the bumper. I just cut a notch there and glued those into place on the bottom side. Now, there weren't enough amber lenses to do that, so I just painted some clear lenses for this unit, and I made them amber like the box art. On the back side, just scrape some of that glue off, or paint off of the mounts there, and put the taillights into place. Also, there's a clear lens, and that goes to the right side of the left turn signal. Alright, we're going to spend a little time on the side view mirrors because they're a very important part of trucking, and these are in bad shape. They have ejector pin marks all over them, sprue attachment points, and well, the large holes there that are supposed to be for mirrors don't fit. So we're going to do quite a bit of work on these. I found that some 1/16 rod would fit into those holes nicely. So I removed the hump on the back of the mirrors. You see the red lines there, so that I could glue those 1/16 rods in place of the tiny little pegs and posts there that are supposed to be mounted into those holes. And you can also see that there are ejector pin marks right on the mirror surfaces. They couldn't put them on the back side, I guess, because of those humps that were on the back. But there's a lot of ways to refinish these. But you could fill them in, you could paint them with chrome paint, you could use some gold foil, you could just plate the whole thing. But I'm going to show you a different method. You can see some reflective material here from 3M. This actually comes out of the bottom of display cases for cars. It's just a reflective plastic material that's laminated, and so I traced the mirror faces, on the bottom there on the corner, as you see, and I'm going to cut those out and apply those later as the mirror faces. I glued those 1/16 rods to the back of the mirror faces, and then I mocked up the assembly using some quake hold putty, but you can use any blue tack, etc. to do that. The arrow shows where I glued the upright, the oblique upright to the horizontal upright on the top bracket there, and that is to stabilize and strengthen the unit. Now you see the white spots there on the door. The mirror posts have to be attached to the door. They open with the door so that they're always in position and you don't run into them with the door. I used the putty there to mock up the position for both the upper and lower bracket, and then I turned, of course, the mirror face so that it was reflecting backwards, and then I glued the whole thing together in position. Now you see, after I've removed them from the putty and on the face there of the door, they are standalone units. Just let them set and dry. Leaving the adhesive side paper and the paper that, or the plastic that's actually on the mirror face itself, I went and cut those out, and then I shaped them. You can shape them because they're just plastic units. Now, as you see, I painted the mirror units gloss black, and the blanks for the mirror faces are set and ready to apply. Now you just peel off the backing paper here and stick those to the mirror units, and as you can see, the reflective surface on the other side, the mylar's been removed. It's very shiny. You can see the reflection on the paper just in front of it. Before we put those mirrors in place, we're going to work on that pogo stick in back, because the mirrors are the easiest thing to get knocked off of your model. In this shot, you see the red arrow pointing to the left there. That's a place that's scratched off on top of the frame for the pogo stick. And the white arrow is pointing to a hole that I drilled in the that blank there that I put to mount the body on. So it's just a hole there. So this is where you can thread your cable. Speaking of which, the cable that comes with the kit, isn't coiled, and these units have coiled connectors on them. So you're going to want to coil that cable, and I just wrapped it around a piece of plastic and then put a heat gun on it and taped a couple straight ends for use, and then it stays set that way. And here you see the unit installed there. It just looked like a good position to put it in. I think they may slide those back and forth along the frame depending on what kind of trailer they have, but you can see from the other direction that it looks pretty good there, although it's right behind the driver's seat, although I don't think it gets in his way. Now it's finally time to add those mirrors. You just scratch off a couple spots in the corner there where you can glue that to the door frame. Just use a drop of glue. You can either use slow setting glue, but I recommend some super glue and a little accelerant because the other side you have to put on and it's hard to tip the unit over to get a good angle at it. So here you see all the parts and decals that I didn't use, except for one yellow decal which I tried on the body, and it just melted in. You couldn't even see it. It's not opaque enough to stand up to darker colors. Well, a little drop of glue to add the radiator cap to the radiator up front and on top, and your model is complete. And if you look at it from 2 feet away, it's gorgeous. And what a great subject matter kit, you know. If you spend a little time with decals and paint, she can look really beautiful. Or if you want to dirty it up for a work truck, which is what these the originals were meant for, it still looks great on your shelf. And as you can see, you can do a lot of things to make it look pretty good, but you still have those chrome sprues that need work if you want a really nice looking model. But overall, it's kind of nice looking, even at that. So if I were you, I'd buy one and put it on my shelf. Well, we hope you like this premium step-by-step model kit review, and so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do that by clicking on the icon on the lower right of any of our reviews, or you can find us on Facebook or our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks.